All right, we are going to get going. Thank you for your patience and welcome. Really excited to have this phenomenal group here today to go through today's topic. From MFA to Granular Access Controls, we have guests from awesome companies like Okta, Duo, and Apono. So this is all about thinking about what does this new identity access management landscape look like in the modern world. So let me go through a quick agenda and then we'll do introductions of our esteemed guests today. So the agenda, we'll go through introductions, then we'll talk a little bit about the challenges of the modern IT environment, talk about the age-old question of security versus user experience, go through the concept of the roadmap to zero trust. How does MFA, just-in-time access, all fit into that broader strategy? And then we'll open it up for a Q&A in the end. If you have questions, please throw those in the Q&A section in the chat. Everyone is muted by default, and we will make sure to get to those. I'm your host today. My name is Dan Perelskin, and we have a really cool set of guests here. I was with Access Security. We were an early startup going after the zero trust space, building a secure service edge platform. We were acquired most recently by HP Aruba, and I've got a really awesome lineup of guests here. So let's go through and I'll let them introduce themselves. Wolf, would you do the honors of leading off?
Hey, absolutely. Great to be here, Dan. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Wolfgang Gorlick. I'm an advisory CISO with Dual Security, now part of CISO Secure, where my history has always been in IAM. So I'm so excited for this conversation. Such a critical point in time where changes we can make in identity and authentication and the experience can have tremendous impacts on our security posture.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. That was awesome. And then Sean.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for having me here. Thanks everyone for joining. Sean Frazier, Federal CSO at Okta. It's a fancy title for a gray-haired dude who's been doing security for a while. I look after Okta's federal practice, which consists of our FedRAMP modern environments. We have a FedRAMP high environment as well as a DoD impact level 4 environment. So we're fully all in. All the chips are in on public sector. So good to be here.
Super critical. Awesome. And then Rome.
I am Rome, the co-founder and CEO of Apono, where we empower the workforce with just-in-time access in a way that's secure and protecting the customer data. A little bit of my background: spent the better half of a decade in the cybersecurity vulnerability research space, and shifted to the IAM, where I think it's the most critical area when we talk about cybersecurity in today's landscape.
Awesome. Love the background. So before we move on to our first topic of the modern IT environment, I had a couple questions for you all. So has everyone had their cup of coffee? Because I know some of you are on the West Coast here. Looking like everyone's peppy and ready.
Tea. So I'm a tea guy, but yeah, caffeine.
Okay.
Yep.
What's your tea of choice?
Earl Grey, baby.
Earl Grey. Very nice. Okay. And then this is always an interesting one. How did you get your start in cyber? So maybe we'll let Wolf lead that one off also. First experience there.
Oh, so, the movie Hackers was still in the movie theaters. And I used to say that as like, oh yeah, hackers, right? I wanted to get in security. Right? And now I tell that story to college kids and they're like, what movie? We don't watch the classics. Like, oh, you're killing me. But no, Hackers was in the theaters. I was at a hospital system. They were going through a digital transformation, which at the time meant taking typewriters away from nurses. And I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time and got my start laying cable, setting up servers, and writing code.
That's awesome. I'll make sure and search around on Snapchat for the movie Hackers and see if it's there. And then Sean.
Yeah, so I fell into this kind of by accident. So I was at this little company called Netscape back when we were kind of starting this whole internet thing, and we created this thing called a certificate server, and we had this LDAP directory server, and most of the people in my group were like, well, we know web servers, I know HTTP, but I don't know what the hell this certificate server is. So I just kind of started installing certificate servers and PKI, and it's all been downhill or uphill from there, depending on how you look at it.
That's awesome. Rome.
Yeah. So, in Israel, it's like, you study computer science, you're before the military, and the military kind of pushes you into the right direction, where cybersecurity is a big part of the intelligence unit. And that's how, that's what got me into the space. And never left ever since.
That's awesome. I was at eloan.com and we were working on, basically a lot of online based lending. So there's a ton of regulation there. And then, the mortgage industry kind of tanked and I went over to Neustar and worked on like DNS cache poisoning, some of those things back in 2008. So interesting, all different backgrounds and should make for a fun conversation. So thank you for humoring me there. Let's talk about our first topic. And when I think of this concept, challenges of the modern IT environment, what is the modern IT environment is probably a first question we should sort of dig into. I'll tell you what I'm seeing just in my own day-to-day, both from internal as well as customer facing, is there's just a big change, even in the last few years. But when we started adopting cloud, it really changed things in containers, and how we think about permissions to those environments is just radically different than how we used to treat a network. And I think, we talk a little bit about the term zero trust, so maybe we'll open up a question around kind of what that means also in this modern IT environment. But, that's a pretty fundamental shift, right? Because I think the initial owner of this new modern IT environment is a little different than it was in the past, potentially. So maybe I'll open that one up to Sean. When you think about sort of this restructuring of ownership of permissions in the modern world versus maybe where it was 20 years ago, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think kind of the two biggest challenges that I see almost all the time are baggage and culture. So baggage is legacy. So that we build something and we tend to leave it alone. If it ain't broke, we don't fix it. And then we just layer things on top of it. So we end up with layers and layers of baggage that we've got to deal with and unwind. And if you look at zero trust as just one more thing to layer on top of it, you're kind of looking at it the wrong way. I think you need to look at zero trust as an opportunity to simplify. But it's also a cultural exploration too, because it's a change in the way we think about security. It's really a mindset shift. People call it a framework. It's not something that you'll ever complete. It's kind of like a lifestyle choice. So you don't wake up one day and go, at the end of April, I'm going to be fit and I'm never going to have to work out again. Zero trust is that way. You just got to build it into your DNA. You got to build it into your process, and you got to use that as an opportunity to simplify. Because again, the more you add to your system, the next thing you know, that for every dollar you spend, if you're spending 90% on supporting the legacy, then you only got 10 cents to do the cool stuff. So you got to balance that out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Wolf, when you think of this, are there emerged threats that are top of mind for you and your customers, or are there things that kind of, how would you define the modern IT environment as well?
Well, the modern IT environment is this great, fantastic engine of next-gen everything, AI everything, microservices everything. Teeny tiny layer pulling this entire wagon train of legacy technology. And it's always fascinating because we focus so much on securing the newest stuff that we oftentimes overlook all that baggage that Sean is talking about. But the other thing that I think we struggle with is this idea that if I just get this control in place, right? If I just could do asset management, I'd be fine. If I could just patch my servers, I'd be fine. If we could just, then everything would be okay. What we're seeing right now is an inflection point where enough people are starting to do multi-factor. We've said for a long time that a lot of attacks would go away if we did multi-factor. And we've reached that inflection point. And by golly, the attackers aren't stopping. I thought they would have got the memo. We told them, once everyone's running multi-factor, you should stop, go home, game over, we've won, we've deployed. But funny enough, the criminals are working around it. We're starting to see, phishing attacks, bypass attacks, flood attacks, proxy attacks. And all that to me indicates a couple different things. First off, it's a good reminder that we need to be thinking about controls in layers and holistically and systemically. And second off, as we adopt things like zero trust or whatever our latest, security models are, we absolutely have to remember that all better mousetraps do is breed better mice, right? We absolutely have to remember that 3-4 years from now, once everyone's doing it, the adversaries are going to be ramping up. So we have to be thinking a couple steps ahead, which, because we've been so buried for so many years, can be difficult for many security organizations.
Those are good.
I think Wolf hits on a good point. MFA was never meant to be the end all be all because it's cumbersome for user experience, but it did make the attackers work a little harder because we weren't making it hard for them for the previous 10 years where we just had passwords. We made it super easy. So we did up level it. We made them work a little harder, spend a little more money, but we still got room to grow.
Can I just throw more factors at the problem? Is that the solution?
Your users love that, by the way.
Yeah, we'll hit that one on the next topic on security versus user experience. Rome, what are you seeing out there?
So I'll touch on just on the environment change that I'm kind of the way that I look at things. I think there's three main changes that have occurred, in the modern IT environment. I think the first one is that it's not just an IT environment at some level. So the modern IT environment actually encapsulates engineering as well. Because once we've shifted to the cloud, we've actually shifted the environment and infrastructure to not only belong to what was considered IT, but to actually be somewhat in the hands of the engineering teams, whether they like it or not. And that's something that's maybe the first thing that we're seeing in this change. I think the other two other critical pieces to this is it's a larger environment, it's a more complex environment, and at the same time it's so much easier to make it larger and complex because today with the click of a button you double or triple or quadruple the size of your environment, and the challenges that come with that of course are not getting any easier. Maybe a third thing to note here from the challenge perspective is the stricter regulations that we're seeing in the market today when it comes to managing. We're talking about access in this webinar. So stricter regulation, whether it's the European GDPR, whether it's here the CCPA and the CMCC. I don't even remember the letters of that one, but they're not making it any easier to manage it properly. Again, just bringing in challenges, not any solutions at this point.
Yeah, more acronyms, just like more layers of MFA, right?
So I'll throw another acronym at you, which I think is important. And yeah, Rome hit on this, which is exactly right, is that CISA has been talking about kind of secure by design or secure by default for a while. And they're going to start talking about it really, really hard. You cannot have that conversation without developers.
What do you mean by that? Can you expand?
So if you're going to be secure by design or secure by default, it starts with development. It starts with your developers securing things from the ground floor, literally from the basement.
Yeah.
And then building security into your infrastructure. And the challenge has always been that everyone builds product and then we hand it to the users and say, the product's great, but you got to do 100 things to secure it, right? Anyone in the government knows what a STIG is, right? We all hate to love or love to hate STIGs. What should happen is when it comes out of development, it should already do those things.
Got it. Yeah. Built in versus bolt on. Like, let's start with security in mind, secure development lifecycle and so on. I love that. That's a great call. Let's jump to the next one to ask this next question, I think, which is we were chatting a little bit before we got started here, and we had the topic of standing privilege versus just in time. So when you start thinking about security versus user experience, these tend to be at odds. I think there are opportunities now with a lot of the solutions that the three companies you all represent have brought to bear. Like, I go through your solutions, on a daily basis. Well, my company, I think, works with all three. Is it asset oriented? Like, where do we think about what should have standing privilege versus what should have, really tight just in time kind of privilege? Where does privileged access line get drawn? Maybe I'll kick it over to Wolf to open that one up if it's not putting you on the spot too much.
Sure thing. And are you thinking specifically for security versus user experience, or?
Security versus user experience in the context of what makes something critical enough that we need to put in those extra controls, the granular controls and the extra checks before we give access to it. Like, that's obviously a really big problem in a very large organization, just to understand what user and what asset we should map our controls to, right?
Right. And, part of it is, for the longest time, we've thought about where the user's going, and we didn't have good intelligence in terms of whether the user was a trustworthy individual or an attacker. And so we had to assume effectively everyone in our system was potentially an attacker. Therefore, let's put controls on every single action. And therefore, let's weight that poor user down just in case they might go rogue. I think what we're moving towards is basically a bifurcation. If you look at the path the user takes and the path the adversaries take, really frustrating the adversaries by putting controls on their path and reducing the controls on the user. That's part one. Now, when you think about just-in-time, or when you think about those controls and the cost of the controls, obviously the more complicated it is, the more spend is required, the bigger the team, the more we're forced to prioritize. And when we prioritize, we need to prioritize around what matters to the organization, where we're making money, what's our mission, what's our intent, those are the things, and what matters to the criminal. What they want to steal is oftentimes not what we think is most valuable, right? There's this bifurcation of the adversary and the internal person. So we look at those overlaps, we look at the then, and that's where we put controls in place. Now, that is how we do it. And why do we do that? We do that because it's too complicated oftentimes to put controls everywhere. So when we think about just-in-time, if you don't have a good infrastructure or component to do it, you're going to prioritize very rigorously. You're going to look at your most privileged systems. You're going to look at your most privileged sensitive data. You're going to look at the things that lure in adversaries. But I would argue, just like with any other control, the more easy it is to deploy it and the better the user experience is, the more we can open up that lens. Maybe not just our tier 0. What about our tier 1? What about our tier 2? What about a holistic experience where we're provisioning entitlements when and where they're needed? The easier it is to manage those controls, the more broadly we can deploy those controls.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing that so much from, I think, what you touched on there from my customers and the folks that I talk to, both internally in our security team and whatnot, that the need for ease of use for users and simplicity is actually becoming a critical attribute of a security system. And like, if you're not starting with that in mind and making sure that whatever control you're putting in place takes that user experience or administration in mind, that it's probably not going to scale for this new modern world, which is, very agile, right? So it's an interesting call out. So with that in mind, how, Sean, have you thought about maybe easing the friction to the front door, or even like role-based, who should have one level of friction versus another? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, we're in a really neat place when it comes to kind of juxtaposing security with user experience. And we as security people have always made it harder for users. That's just what we do. We have password requirements, and then we just layer on additional password requirements. It's got to be harder. You got to change it more often. It's got to have all these special characters in it, which just force users to do unnatural things. We're at a point now where I think we can provide better user experiences with actually up-leveling that security. It's all about kind of knowing what you're protecting. And this is one of the hardest things. If you look at zero trust and you look at the concept of inventories, it's always easy to do user inventories, and it's easy to do device inventories. We have systems that track those things. It's a lot harder to do data inventories and figuring out, well, what's the data they're trying to access? Can they do it with just a simple MFA or simple, phishing resistant factor authentication, or do I need to up-level them to something else based upon what they're trying to access as a privileged system? So I think part of that is kind of the workflows around the automation and figuring out which applications are touching which data, which users need access to those applications. And always thinking in your mind the concept of adding friction to attackers, not users, meaning that if users are in the right place, then you can kind of make sure that you're detecting all of the attributes of whatever that is. So they're in the right place, they're in the right device, everything looks good, they've updated their stuff, then let them sail through, still with a phishing resistant factor. But it could be, an Okta Fast Pass or a Duo, where it's something where it's very passwordless and very seamless. And if any of those behaviors or any of those things change, then you can up-level them. Then you can start asking them additional questions. So if anyone starts looking a little more attacker-ish, then you can start adding friction.
Mm-hmm. John Fisher's dropping some knowledge here in the chat too about we're kind of starting to create almost like smarter adversaries, as well as I'm going to extrapolate that into a smarter internal threat of someone trying to figure out their way around the friction, right? Because you're going to get more creative. One of the things that we're hearing from our internal cyber team is like tamper resistance of our controls. One of their critical requirements as we implement our product across HPE of 100,000 users is if it's not tamper resistant, that's a real problem, because the users will try and find a way around it. Now, hopefully we don't make it so that they'll want to tamper with it because it's a good experience, right? But it's an interesting point that y'all are calling out there.
Yeah, John's exactly right. The better the better you make it for users and the easier you make it for users while still providing the best security is kind of the best of all worlds, because we don't live in a world anymore where we issue a laptop to somebody or issue a desktop to somebody and we patch it, we control it, and we do all the things to it. They're carrying smartphones, they're doing their personal devices. So it's a whole different world now.
It is. And I think if you add to that the fact that today customers are expecting very fast value, and I think Dan touched on this a little bit with the agile part. With that, your teams are required to to get that productivity, or to get that ability to kind of perform their work with as least friction, or if we were at a place before where it was okay that you could have waited or received, it would have taken time to receive what you needed. Today, that productivity always wins, and us as security companies over here need to accept that, need to actually bring in the solution that takes both in mind. I think most companies today are actually at a situation where it's more of a lose-lose. Like, I think most companies today are somewhat overprivileged in their environment, or maybe a lot overprivileged, and then at the same time, from a productivity perspective, you're seeing their users, like you said, finding ways around to be able to somewhat hack their own system. I'll give you an example that I saw, just like using an application token to access some production environment, just because you need to fix something in production. You're doing this from a good heart, from a good place, but you're actually not able to perform such necessary work because of security measures that were put in place. And it's our responsibility to find and build those tools that would allow them to do that.
Yeah, and if we don't do that, then we basically, the world is their oyster. So it can be BYO everything. It could be bring your own code repository. Everything is out there for people to do. And if we don't give developers and people the tools to do this, they're just going to find the tools. That's one Google search.
Exactly.
Yeah, Wolf, were you going to add something there?
Well, I was just going to add on that the way that I've always thought about this is, controls are constraints, right? And a constrained user is a creative user, and a creative user is a dangerous user. So the tighter we make those controls, and the slower we make it for them, everything that Ram and Sean said comes right into play. They're going to get creative, and that's going to be dangerous for our security controls.
Yeah. How do you think maybe, Ram, one of the things that we talked about was the need for visibility and auditability, so that even if something does happen, maybe we understand what happens. How does that manifest itself here?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I actually want to kind of build up on something that Sean had said. I think it starts out from, I like to call it circles of trust, but I think it's around building something around the more sensitive or privileged assets, and rather than trying to protect everything, but actually looking, what is most sensitive in the environment? Where do we start off? And then getting that auditability and visibility, of course, over that specific privileged resources, privileged applications that you're trying to protect, and then if you're able to find a way to granularly give those permissions there, then you're limiting, you're not hurting the experience as much. And I think that's where it all kind of sits on the fact that today, you might have to make a choice if to give this admin access to the sensitive resource rather than the granular permission that person needs inside, because of the friction that includes to be able to give him only that granular permissions. And I think that's where a lot of the the friction part is kind of covered there.
Is role-based access the future of that, or is there something that we have to change our mentality on for that? Maybe
I think it starts with role-based access, but to Roma's point, this has to be automated. And we talk about attribute-based access. We get granular down to the, your user record has attributes that defines what you do. These attributes can then be pushed and shared with either other identity systems or application systems or whatever. And it's got to be dynamic, because we work in dynamic environments. I know in our environment alone, we have people moving off projects, other projects all the time, leaving the organization, joining the organization nonstop. And if we don't understand that model, then we got user accounts hanging out that shouldn't be hanging out. We got people who can't do their job. We got people who spend 2 weeks trying to figure out how to move them from project A to project B. And that's not sustainable.
Yeah,
I agree completely. RBAC is something that companies strive to achieve, but essentially it's so dynamic that you need to build the methods like, more attribute based, more, workflow and automation involved to kind of have that continuously trying to achieve that RBAC in place and building the methods above that, like we've kind of talked about in the privilege zone. Yeah.
There's a question in the Q&A here, and I'm going to try and read it properly. I may mess it up because there's some parentheses and stuff, but it says, how can we achieve access control to cross-platform applications or devices? Or like what constraints would there be for cross-platform, i.e., if you're using Active Directory, but a Linux platform, but how do you do that through any IAM platform? It's an interesting question of how do you bring it all together? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I can.
Go ahead, Wolf.
I can take a start at that. So, effectively, whenever we think about access control, right, we have to think about who the user is, what attributes we know about them, what groups or roles they're in, and be able to share that information across multiple platforms. And, coarse-grained, it starts at the authentication layer. What am I allowed to authenticate into? What am I checking at that time of authentication? Where am I coming from? You can start at that very high level, pass it into single sign-on. Now I'm going to enrich that data. I'm going to provide more information in a token or assertion or any number of different mechanisms to pass it on down the systems. And then, of course, it will get consumed by the system and by the application. And then within that application, the authorization model works. Now, across that entire chain, there's a number of different control points from authentication to single sign-on, right down the chain. And then we want to be able to monitor that and, of course, dial those points up or dial them down to do what we were talking about earlier, which is to reduce the friction of the user experience.
Mm-hmm. That's a great call.
Yeah, I was gonna say something very similar. The only thing I'll add is that, consolidate where you can, federate where you must, right? It's one of those things where, every organization I talk to has at least 50 different identity platforms, right? Because it used to be it was like Cracker Jack prizes. You used to get an application, you got a free directory with it. That's just the way it worked. And everyone kind of threw out their directories and just deployed them because that was the path of least resistance. They did the app, had a directory. Now the next thing you know, you got an explosion of identity systems. So part of it is planning and can consolidate where you can, but part of it is, hey, if I acquired a company, they're not going to move off their platform, they're not going to move off their RBAC, then I got to federate. So just plan it out.
Yeah, I love that. You get a directory. Everyone gets a directory. Yeah, go ahead.
Everyone gets a directory. I love that. We did a study on this, we being Cisco. We looked at like 5,000 organizations across, I think, 20, 30 different countries. And one of the things we were trying to figure out is like, what are some of the underlying commonalities between organizations that have zero trust and that organizations don't, right? Like, where are people struggling when they deploy it? And one of the things that we found, to Sean's point, was if you were consolidated, you were more than twice as likely to say you were successful in zero trust. If you're federated and on a cloud identity platform, you're more than twice as likely to be showing successes in zero trust. And the opposite comes right into play, right? Like if you're not consolidated, if you're not federated, you run into a lot of friction. And so the data also supports exactly what Sean's saying here.
Super interesting.
And I didn't even read that report. So wow.
Imagine you had this as an original thought. John keeps this chat spirited. He's saying RBAC can be a 4-letter word, which we can all appreciate. With that in mind, I'm thinking that John should be part of the panel. He's dropping
John sounds some wisdom in
there.
I
don't know, John, but I want to invite him in. I assume someone planted him as a mole to keep my job interesting today. Let me take a step back even, because I think this is always a fun question to ask. So what does zero trust mean to you? And Rome, we're going to give you first shot at that so that you can mess with the other guys.
No problem. Yeah. So I think zero trust is, it's a concept. It's not really a solution. It's really a concept that says, hey, trying to start off from everyone has the ability to kind of do everything and trying to limit that to very specific to only what you need when you need it. So I think it's called right. Trust no one. Give it. I don't. You can fill me up on this, Dan. What's the acronym?
Never trust, always verify, I think is
never trust, always verify. So I think that's where, you know, what companies are trying to achieve. It becomes difficult when you're trying to achieve that across your environment, like the question that we just had, across multiple platform, across multiple acquisition that your company has, you know, might have made. And I think that is to tackle that, you need to first have that strategy in place, but also to have that understanding that that you can't have everything necessarily consolidated to a level that it's all in maybe one Active Directory and it's all connected via Okta, for example, to every single application that you ever have, and all the roles, you know, very granularly defined. It's something it's very hard to accomplish, and that's why you kind of need to build your strategy around, again, back to where we were before. What's most important? What are our crown jewels? Let's start off from there, and then slowly build it around it, rather than trying to achieve zero trust over the whole, you know, the whole environment.
Who wants next? Sean.
Yeah, I can go. I mean, to me, this is just the natural inevitability of the world we find ourselves in, right? We're all cloud, we're all mobile. We need the same security constructs across everything that we do. I always look at zero trust as a lifestyle choice. It's a change in behaviors. It's an evolution of how we think about security, and really moving security to the edge, moving security to the endpoints, which end up being the user on the access device, accessing the application where the data lives. It doesn't mean you don't encrypt all the things on the network. Of course you do. I mean, you encrypt everywhere you're going to be encrypting, but you know, there's going to become a point in time, if you think about, you know, BYO devices and you know, users having their own, you know, kind of sovereignty. You know, there's also the concept of bring your own networks, right? I mean, most of the people in the pandemic was kind of a shining example of this, where you work from Starbucks, you work from other places, you work from home, you work almost everywhere except for the office. So there is no concept of trust in the network layer, right? The trust in the network layer should be gone. I always hear people say, well, my on-prem solutions are more secure than my cloud solutions, and that's just bullshit. There's no way that is true, because you know, once you connect it up to the internet, that became completely untrue.
Yeah, Wolf.
So I'll be a little more technical. When I think about zero trust, right, I think about trust boundaries. I think about it as a dynamic trust boundary, something that's short-lived, back to just in time, something that's tightly scoped between my device, and the resource I'm trying to get to, something that's enforced by policy, and that policy being informed by trust signals and telemetry. So trust boundaries, short-lived, tight-scoped, policy-driven. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we have historically extended trust and created trust boundaries statically, thinking ahead, thinking about, you know, based on roles or based on where people were in the environment, and put in as much friction as possible in case things go wrong. Why? Because we didn't have a policy enforcement. We didn't have trust signals. We didn't have the ability to react and respond quickly. So if we think about zero trust as this idea like default deny, no one does default deny. Well, we all do default deny, but no one does, you know, deny all, right? We start with deny all, then we poke holes and we open things up where it makes sense. We start with this idea of zero trust, and then we quickly drop that zero and we move to appropriate trust. Appropriate trust informed by what we can see and what the user is trying to do.
Oh, I love that. I always said that I thought John Kindervag did one of the worst disservices from a marketing perspective by calling it zero trust. I mean, I get the premise, but at the same time, boy, did it not make every CTO and CIO cringe when they heard that, right?
Well, you got to remember, he called it zero trust networking, and the marketing people lopped off the networking piece, because what he was saying was the network is irrelevant. Don't trust the network. We're all on the same network.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I think that's because I've spent the last 4 years helping customers implement it, and training, you know, a new SDR out of college that's, you know, in sales. What does zero trust mean, right? And so I think of it that way, as like, you're no longer trusting someone because they have an IP on the network. We're going to really map users to applications, workload, servers, whatever it is, but it's about starting with user and identity and having a mapping to what they need, not the network, right? You don't just give access to the network, you give access to the specific thing you need, and then you prove it along the way. And I think one of the interesting things that's come up along the way is this sort of differentiation of authentication and authorization. I think both of you and Rome talk about this in the past, because that is sort of a misunderstood concept. They sound the same, but the idea of authentication and that point of proof versus continuing to monitor and authorize against some policy throughout the session, so that maybe you proved who you were, but your location changed, or there's whole concept of adaptive MFA and zero trust solutions that can help implement more of a zero trust outcome for the customer. Again, within that architectural ideal. Paul Simmons, who was former Jericho Forum back to 2003, way before Forrester and John coined zero trust, I think it was 2010. Talked about those things, right? Of like keeping your protection near your asset, as opposed to, some of the former ways of doing it with deperimeterization. So I think it's a term that gets thrown around and stretched into a lot of marketing, unfortunately, but I think it's also an opportunity to educate and change the architectural ideal within, call it our networks. But I think in this modern world, it's beyond network, right? Because we're talking cloud and we're talking much more. So those are some of the things I think. I would feel free to add in or correct or change or whatnot. But from there, we'll go into this roadmap.
Yeah, no,
I think that's. Sorry, Rom, go ahead.
And we all start at once.
I'll be short. No, I think what you're touching on that is great, because I think the network has somewhat shifted like into the management of the cloud itself. So at some level, it's now a policy that's being managed in the cloud. So it's just another resource, it's just another resource, the network itself. And so, somewhat similar to how zero trust moves the controls into the resources, also the network is now a resource, so also the controls is moved to being policy based. So like now we're managing these policies across multiple clouds, multiple applications, and that's actually managing access today. And one more point to note, I think Wolf, that you touched on a great point. So like, you start from zero trust and it moves to appropriate trust. And the reason for that, of course, is the business needs to move forward. We talked about experience, we talked about productivity, having those, and this is for the audience out here, having those processes in place to not, tuck it under the covers, but actually say, hey, let's have the process to give those one-offs, to give that ability to gain that limited scope, rather than just slowly opening it up and not ever taking anything back. But let's make it as part of a process, is something that you need to have, and that will actually help you stay, stay somewhat close to maybe the RBAC that you were trying to achieve. So yeah.
Yeah, and when we look at extending or revoking trust, I mentioned each one of those points. We shouldn't be able to authenticate from everywhere, right? There is 16 billion devices on the planet. Why should anyone be able to authenticate on any one of those 16 billion devices? maybe we just look at our company's devices, or maybe even better, we just look at my devices, for example. We shouldn't be able to do authorization and get our least privilege access, whatever those entitlements and privileges are, all the time. Why should those be standing? If the context and conditions change, if I'm doing something inappropriate, I should be able to, by policy, revoke that trust. Right? I'm trusting the person to authenticate. I'm trusting the person within my application, and that policy enforcement, the idea of I'm going to do just-in-time access, or I'm going to do risk-based authentication, I think is the critical differentiator between zero trust and what we used to do.
Sean,
I was going to say pretty much the exact same thing as Wolf. Big surprise. There's a reason why identity is pillar one in zero trust. That was done on purpose. And it's because a lot of these things kind of exist in real time and time of need when somebody's requesting access to something. So being able to do that and making a risk assessment very, very quickly is important. That's the important part of this. And being able to figure out, there are lots of, Wolf's organization, my organization, all of us are part of this shared signal framework piece that's coming out of the Open Standards organization area, where we're all sharing risk signals, and we're all being able to do that at time of need versus after the fact, because the after the fact is way too late. That's why the friction has to be at the front door.
Yeah, that's a great call. You would think you two worked together or something in the past.
I know, crazy, right?
And then I think to your point, Wolf, on the 16 billion devices, I was trying to explain the internet. My son asked his mom, "What's the internet?" And that's a fun thing. He's 4 years old. So to your point, it sounds crazy when you start to describe it as a security professional. They're like, yeah, just 16 billion devices all able to talk to each other all at once. No big deal. It'll be fine. Well, $1 trillion, adversarial industry gets created around that. And here we are. So I'll explain the second part about cybersecurity to him next year.
I hope that conversation went well. My daughter was about the same age. I explained it to her, and I walked her through like servers and firewalls, And at the time, I had a rack in my study. And about a week later, her friend's like, hey, your friend's over, and my daughter's like, hey, do you want to see the internet? And I thought I'd really explained it well. And her friend's like, yeah, I want to see the internet. So she pulls her into my study. She goes, look, it's on my daddy's servers. And that was how she internalized it. Like, this structure right here is the whole internet. So I hope you did a better job than me, my friend.
If the internet is on your server, it sounds like you're running a honeypot. So let's see. I got a question in the chat. Of course, we open the zero trust thing and we go for 10 minutes before I can look again. With teams always overutilized and having to do more with less, a mindset of point solutions, putting out immediate fires and not seeing the forest through the trees, it's detrimental to security correctly, to do security correctly. How do you design or pitch to senior leaders controls and processes to eat the elephant one bite at a time? And that's perfect cue up here for roadmap to zero trust, right? So who would love to take a pass at that one? Because that is a great question from just an operational perspective.
Yeah, it is. I can start with this one. And again, I'll go back to my comment about, identity's pillar one for a reason. That's usually, it's a good place to start. It's a good place to kind of start the conversation around zero trust. But I've seen, again, this is not really a technology problem. So when I talk to agencies and organizations about zero trust, the ones who kind of get it have formed this philosophy around, center of excellence around changing the concepts and the mindset of security. And you kind of have to do that first. If you continue to kind of try to bang the square peg into the round hole of zero trust in the current infrastructure and exactly what you're doing today, you will almost inevitably fail, because you have to position it to executive leadership in the context of modernization, in the context of focus, and because that also becomes a budget conversation. And once it becomes a budget conversation and you ask for money, it's a whole different flavor when you're just saying, okay, I need to do these other things. So center of excellence approach, board level conversations around why this is important, why it's important to do security. Why is it important to do security? Because no one wants to end up on the front page of a paper. No one wants to sit in front of CISA or the OMB and have to talk about why they've been breached. So this is why it's important. So you got to have that juxtaposed with the budget conversations.
Yeah. I was chatting with Dan Fry, the CISO of Enterprise Security at HPE, about how we're going to make the move and, get some of these quick wins, like the first one for them. That's pretty obvious, to start to deprecate the VPN for most users. Most users don't need full network access. So, it's absolutely a board level conversation for him. And to be able to get some of those quick wins, go after a use case. Maybe it's third-party access. We talked about that a little bit before the conversation, right? Maybe it's customer or whatever, but starting to move some of those excessive privileges off of, what traditionally had pretty broad access is a big win, I think, for the business. I remember one of our, we had a really great security advisor that worked at our company in a prior stage that we were in. And she said, what would be the value for every user you get off of your VPN and onto more of a zero trust paradigm, where they don't have that full access to your whole network? It was a really interesting question she asked one of our customers and always came to mind.
And it always also gets back to what we talked about earlier with user experience, right? I'm a big fan of more carrot, less stick. So bring to your application, folks, the ability to seamlessly do user experience, phishing resistant factor kind of stuff, passwordless kind of authentication and experience, and leverage that carrot to sell it.
Yeah, Wolf, did you have any further thoughts on sort of that? How do you eat the elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say first that I think the phrase "it's a journey" was the greatest thing that consultants ever pulled on the industry. It's a journey. Just keep paying us. It's a journey. We'll get there. It's a journey is incredibly hard as an executive to sell to a board. I think we need to have either every 6 months, or if you're on a quarterly OKR model, every quarter, some value that we're showing for zero trust. And some of the organizations I'm now going into their 4th year on the roadmap, advising them, that's exactly what they do. Every single quarter, they demonstrate something. Now, if you do that without something that John Fisher said in chat, if you do that without first establishing your governance, without establishing your patterns, without establishing your architecture or your reference architecture and your patterns and practices, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of stuff everywhere, which in 5 years will be on a panel and Sean will say, we have a lot of baggage. We built a lot of baggage 5 years ago with zero trust. So it's paramount early stages of your roadmap to get the governance in place, get the committees in place, view it as a culture change, view it as a transformation. Have from a architectural team perspective, say this is what we're building, and then engage the organization and starting to color in those pieces so it all lines up into one cohesive strategy.
Yeah, like that. I think it could be something as simple as what I mentioned earlier, getting a salesperson off of the VPN because they just need access to a couple web applications, or a third party that needs access to, some server that they're servicing for you on behalf of your organization. But Roel, I'm going to throw this one to you because I know you spend a lot of time on this. What about those devs that don't need just access to the front door of the application? They need deeper access to all the rooms inside of the house. How do you think about that and getting, some wins on zero trust beyond front door access?
Yeah, so I'll actually start off from both Sean and Wolf touched on this. So giving carrots and creating the ability to start from the connecting to the users where the end users where they're at and giving them the ability to work is where you actually can start off from. And I'll connect this to something one of our customers was trying to achieve. So they had an environment where the developers they had a combination of developers in the US, developers in India, somewhere in the 300 to 500 range, and they were trying to limit their access directly to databases, to production databases, essentially, that they were in need of gaining access to. Again, it's very granular inside the application, inside specific service in the cloud. And the approach was let's first get that visibility. Actually, let's actually get that visibility, understanding of who needs access to what, and to do that, we'll give them the ability to get pretty much anything they need. They have today the ability to get it, but it's unclear what they're doing and how they're getting it. Let's just put in the controls that they need to go through, and it's very similar to zero trust, right? Let's put in the controls that they need to go through to gain that access, and that will give us the visibility, or give that customer the visibility to who needs and who's doing what and so on. And from there, you can go down and reduce those abilities in a way that doesn't hurt their productivity. And actually, I think that encapsulates within that what the road to zero trust, starting from a very specific example, but I think taking that and looking at the larger picture, I think that's a good analogy to understand.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I know Gartner just brought out their, I don't know if it's public yet, but their privileged access management Magic Quadrant. And they talk about how privileged access management is this thing beyond the average user, right? It means a developer that might need database level access. And, to your point, if you can automate some of those permissions versus having to add friction, now you can start to get an understanding of, to Wolf's point, how do you actually build a roadmap? You first need to understand your world, and then you can start to control your world. I think that's a really good dual insight between the two of you. Let me just see our friend.
We're all here on the panel.
Yes. Our missing panel member, John Fisher, says many zero trust projects are all hat and no cowboy. So throw that one in there. That's a great one. Sean, I'm going to throw this back up to you on, how do you think of identity in MFA in this privileged access management world? How should that fit in? And should it look the same as it does for our sales and marketing team, or should a developer that needs deeper access have a different experience?
No, I think when you build an identity solution, you're building an enterprise identity solution. Developer is just a role, and that's someone who needs access to certain things, but they should exist within the same construct. Now, you might have different policies for them based upon what they're accessing, based upon who they are, based upon where they're coming from, what device they're on, right? Pick the variables that you need to understand about that person in order to trust that request. Remember, you're not trusting the user, you're trusting that request. It has to be continuous. So building those things out is not any real different. I mean, the constructs might be different, meaning, again, you don't need a VPN for salesperson going to Salesforce. They got to be on, a corporate issued device. Great. That's pretty easy. Developers might have different context that you have, but the system that supports that should be the same.
That's super interesting. Wolf, maybe get your thoughts. How do you think about building these sort of cohorts into these more privileged environments, or is that something that you've crossed as well?
Yeah, I think Sean really nailed it. We've got to look at it again as an implementation of a pattern. We've got to look at it again as a way to win the developers, or really any person in our environment is doing their job when they look like them, when they're acting like them, when everything is right as rain by policy. We need to get out of their way, right? There should be little to no friction. And when they don't, when any of that changes, when I'm working at my home office and I pick up my laptop and I go to the coffee shop, my environment automatically checks and determines that I've switched Wi-Fi and prompts me to log back in again, right? There should be some friction, some injection when state changes. And historically, we haven't been able to do that, but with policy enforcement at multiple layers and with just in time at multiple layers, finally, we can get out of the way.
Yeah. Rome,
And I'll give a plug to Wolf's organization and my organization, Building Technologies, around this. If that friction is all I got to do is touch my finger to a finger pad, that is awesome.
Yeah,
that's a great call. Go ahead, Wolf. Anything else? I think, to your point, Sean, it's a mix of people, process, and technology, right? Like it's not going to, in most cases, build itself. And unfortunately, as much as we want everything to be built in at the software level, there's a challenge with that because you've got the team managing the databases, the team managing the applications. They're not all in the same room at the same time going, hey, let's all use the same perfect, process to give control. So if there are ways that we can, tie this together, that can be really helpful. And I'll also throw it over to Rome. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on tying things together, and creating unified syntax.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly kind of the approach that we're trying to take. Leveraging the tools like Do and Okta that are in place to give you that, that ability to validate, verify the user, see if something's changed, and then that next level is is internally within these specific resources, and taking both of these two steps together, I think really leads to a full on what you're trying to achieve with Zero Trust. So full on secure but fully frictionless environment and access control processes for the organization. And again, the frictionless part here is definitely a big one, because like has been mentioned in the panel before, companies today, they need to bring very fast value to their customers. They need to stay on top of it. They need to be very productive and effective, and they need to allow their users, internally, and actually not just internally, to be able to do the work, perform the work they need to. And we can't get in the way of that. As security companies here, we need to, we need to actually provide that ability, and at the same time, prove to the board of how, the safest the company could be at any given point.
That's a really interesting point on
what he said. What Rome said.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we've seen a few incidents where a third party in particular has been, challenging, right? I don't want to throw out too many names, but a big financial services org that had a third party go into a lot of records, and then a big consulting organization that had a ransomware, incident that affected a lot of their customers. So these things are happening with third party, and a lot of times we're just hoping our contracts uphold our cybersecurity, aren't we? It's tough if we're not actually putting the controls in place to enforce them. We're basically opening ourselves up to risk. So really good point there.
Like we always say, security is a team sport. So we all have to participate in that. And when you're thinking about secure by design, it's not just your developers, not just your design. It is everybody that is involved in your ecosystem.
It's a great call. Yeah, absolutely. Any more thoughts here? We're still recording, and we have another 5 more minutes here just for Q&A that we had planned. But any other points that the three of you want to throw out there that maybe I missed?
I'm just going to throw out that if anyone's listening to this recording, just read what John Fisher said in the chat, because he pretty much said it all. So he's the unofficial 4th member or 5th member of this group.
Yeah, I wish we had just done the whole thing in writing. We could have gone back and forth with him. We'll have to open a Discord after. John will be our star. So I don't see any additional Q&A here, but Tim, keep me honest if we need to just give another few minutes here. I think we've answered all of them. We did have a nice comment from Robert Blythe. Teams and panelists, thanks for the invite. Great session and informative. Need to head to another meeting, so thank you for that. Appreciate it. We'll just give another minute for any questions. If not, we'll close it down. We'll give everyone a sec to type in case they are. If not, then we'll send it. One thought: how can we leverage an incident to give impetus to support the OCM around this topic, the organization change management? John?
Yeah, never let a good incident go to waste, right? So if you we do these things in our security organization called tabletop exercises around incidents that we see around the internet and kind of play them out and see what they would do to impact our organization. And that they are eye-opening experiences. The results of those tend to go to the executive staff so they can look at it and say, okay, this is how we would handle it, and this is some areas for improvement, and this is so executives know exactly what's going on in the world. So yeah, big fan of that.
Yeah, Wolf, anything to add there? I love that.
Yeah, even before the tabletop, right? I am a big fan of institutional storytelling from a leadership perspective. So heart, head, and hands. Heart, what is it? What is happening? Why is it of interest? Maybe something just happened to our peer. Maybe something just happened to our customer. Maybe there's an attack in the news. Head, what's the statistics? Here's the data on how often that happens. Here's what we're seeing internally in terms of, we saw this 3 times just last month. Hands, what do I need you for? You know, what am I asking? So with next quarter, when we are going to be doubling down on implementing tighter controls around our developer environment, I really want your support, and I'm going to have an ask for you for a couple cycles because we want to get ahead of this and make sure this doesn't happen in our environment. I think from a storytelling perspective, you know, OCM, organizational change management, becomes security one conversation at a time.
That's a great call.
Yeah, and I'm encouraged by just the openness. You know, it used to be, and Wolf know this, and you know, maybe other folks are younger. You know, it used to be we didn't talk about these things, and certainly if government, you know, wouldn't talk about these things, wouldn't share this information. So I think that doing that internally, but also being open and sharing best practices and lessons learned with other folks is good as well, because it's a community, right? And we all have to treat it like the community that it is. The attackers are all a community. They're all getting together and sharing best practices and all that other stuff. So we got to do the same thing. And I'm encouraged that we seem to be doing that.
Yeah, great call, Rome. Anything to add, maybe from even your government or intelligence background?
No, I think they both said it, and I think we'll leave it at that. So yeah.
Cool.
And again, thank you so much for bringing that up. I think it's an important point as well.
Yeah, it sounds good. I love John's one last point here. Used to be like Fight Club, you don't talk about it, and now I think cyber has become much more transparent. You know, you think about, I spent time at HackerOne on the bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure side. You know, this is the new world, is to be able to talk about our biggest challenges and disclose things and make sure that we all understand it's okay. We're going to make mistakes, but we have to learn from them and leverage them and learn from each other's mistakes. And that's the future. That's how we're going to go solve these problems one at a time. Not going to be overnight, but you know, we have to continually get better. So that's anything, right? Whether it's sports or cyber or whatever, you just have to constantly be practicing and constantly getting better. So first,
100%.
let me just also thank you know, Apono, Okta, Duo, Cisco, for your participation here, you know, and each of you playing a part. If we can all come together and have these conversations, we can encourage others to do it as well. And of course, our guest star, John Fisher. So thank you, everyone that, you know, came and stayed, and feel free to add anything else as well.
Yep. Thanks, Dan. Good being with you and Wolf and Rome. Great talking to you guys. It was awesome.
Yeah, and thanks, Tim,
Great
for pulling this all
conversation,
together. Absolutely.
Thank you, Wolf. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dan. All right.
Thanks, everyone.